Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for the invitation today to essentially think with you around the intersection between the equality and diversity agenda on the one hand and the widening participation agenda on the other. And one of the things I hope to do in my presentation is to explore the overlap between those two. So what I'd like to do in the time that I have is to tell you a little bit about ECU, and particularly where its work impacts on the WP agenda. Think with you for a moment about the legal context, the current environment, about which obviously you've heard much and you will continue to hear much, and also some of the opportunities going forward. Now, I hope... Aha, there we are, it does work. That's who we are, in case you don't know. ECU is the higher education sector's equality and diversity resource. That's our mission there. We are funded primarily by the four funding councils of the UK and Universities UK and Guild HE to advance equality and diversity for all of the protected characteristics. That's the technical term that the Equality Act 2010 uses to cover those areas of equality which are protected in law. We do that in a variety of ways. There's some of them, research and investigation projects. We have an advice line. We share information through meetings and otherwise. We run and facilitate networks of practitioners. We publish quite a lot of material. We have a monthly e-newsletter, Equality Link, and through a variety of other web resources. All of our materials, incidentally, are available online, although hopefully many of you will have seen hard copies of them as well. And our current strategy identifies 4 priorities, which is what pretty much all of our programs are tailored to meet. They are to improve the evidence base that we have for equality and diversity, to ensure that the sector meets the ambitions of equality legislation, some of which is still coming on stream, parts of which rather is still coming on stream, to support institutional change, and to assist the sector in meeting what we call the changing economic and political environment. Now that captures a range of work that we're doing. Obviously, the fee changes that are happening that you've been hearing about and thinking about, but also the increasingly diverse arrangements in higher education in the 4 countries of the UK. And the ECU works in all 4 countries. We do that through collaborative work with our funders, clearly with the sector, with sector organisations, trade unions, and other key agencies like the Equality and Human Rights Commission, and also now with increasingly with further education colleges as well, which I'm very pleased about. ECU now, aside from working with them, we now also support FE colleges in Scotland as well as the HE sector UK-wide. So with that context, if I could really begin with what seems to me to be the starting point for equality and widening participation, which is the public sector equality duty in the 2010 Act. Many of you, if not all of you, will be familiar with this. It builds on the 3 separate equality duties that prevailed hitherto. The first one for race, the second for disability, and the third for gender. And it's, I continue to think, one of the key tools in our box, so to speak, for advancing the agenda. It requires public bodies, which includes most universities at least, to think proactively about the equality and diversity agenda, really in the way that they do what they do, and to identify where there is underrepresentation or disproportionality, and to take steps to either eliminate discrimination, harassment and victimization, advance equality of opportunity, and or foster good relations. Advancing equality of opportunity, for those of you with a mind for detail is slightly different from the older public sector duties, which talked about, well, at least one of them, which talked about promoting equality of opportunity. Arguably, advancing is a more robust approach than promoting. It's a bit like angels on a pinhead, really, but anyway, that's the view that I take. Again, for those of you who may not have too much knowledge of this aspect of equality law and practice, it does set out a framework for proactive thinking which doesn't require things to go wrong or for people to bring claims, although interestingly, and I will come back to this, more and more litigation is around the public sector duty, more and more cases are taken about that. Advancing equality of opportunity includes some of those things, removing or minimizing disadvantage suffered by people due to their protected characteristics, meeting the needs of people with protected characteristics, and encouraging people with protected characteristics to participate in public life. This has a tie-in, in my view, to the widening participation agenda, probably most centrally, because although the WP agenda is not coterminous, is not identical with protected characteristics, there is a considerable degree of overlap. Indeed, the Minister's letter to offer the agency charged with advancing this reflects, I think, 3 particular protected characteristics: disability, race, and age, and I want to come back to those in a moment. And in terms of the public sector duty, as with the WP agenda, there are a number of issues and patterns that emerge, including low attainment entry requirements or disproportionate attainment and entry requirements is probably fairer, differing rates of continuation, differing outcomes of degree classification, and differing unemployment rates subsequently post-university. We should mourn, in my view at least, the socio-economic duty, which never was. It was contained in sections 1 to 3 of the Equality Act 2010, and was an attempt to understand, frankly, the impact of class on inequality. It was a relatively modest attempt to do that, and Section 1 of the 2010 Act would have required public bodies to do that. In other words, to have due regard to the desirability of exercising their functions in a way to reduce inequalities of outcome which result from socio-economic disadvantage. Clearly a very heavy overlap with the WP agenda, but as many of you may know, that this government has announced that that provision won't be brought into force. So it isn't, and in all likelihood won't be, an obligation on public bodies, so that the WP agenda won't have that aspect of statutory underpinning, although it would have been very interesting to see what would have happened had it been the case. It also, I have to say, chimed with a lot of discussion around the time of the Equality Act. Some of you may be familiar with a seminal publication by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, The Spirit Level. I haven't got the full title in front of me, but it's something like Why Unequal Societies Are Bad for All of Us, or something to that effect. I found it fascinating to read, and it sort of helped to generate much public discussion around the impact of socio-economic disadvantage alongside other protected characteristics. Nevertheless, that's not in force, in case there's any doubt about it. So, how does the WP agenda intersect with equality and diversity in some detail? Well, first of all, we've tried to pick out some issues of ethnicity. I mentioned to you the Minister's letter, which highlights race and disability, and to an extent age. The picture with regards to black and minority ethnic students in the higher education sector is mixed. On the one hand, there are now higher levels of representation of BME students nationally. Over the past 7 years, the proportion of BME students has increased from 14. This is the overall, if you look at all students in higher education, in 2003/4, 14.9% of students in HE were from black minority ethnic communities. In 2000, actually that should be 2009-10, not 2008-9, but in 2009-10 it had risen to 18.1%, so clearly an improvement there. If you cut the figures, because black and minority ethnic students covers a variety of heritages, and if you look at black students specifically, the increase is fastest from 4.4% to 5.9% of total student numbers in the sector. If you look at continuation rates, white full-time first-degree entrants in 2009-10 were more likely to continue or qualify than BME students, so that 90.4% of all white students attained a degree at the end of their course, whereas only 86.3% of BME students did. Not sure whether that's a significant difference or not being a statistician, but it is a difference. And again, black students were least likely to continue or qualify, the figure for them being 83.7%. If you look at degree attainment, which is a very complicated and to a degree controversial issue, because it's certainly wrong to ascribe one or even two or even three reasons for attainment. Attainment is to do with a whole mix, clearly, of factors. Clearly, the quality of teaching and learning at the institution, but also a range of other wider issues. But nonetheless, if you look at degree attainment, over the past 11 years, the percentage of first-degree undergraduate leavers achieving a first-class honours or upper second-class honours degree has increased for most ethnic groups across the piece. But the attainment gap between white and BME students remains rather. And the difference is, let's make sure I've got my figures correct, in 2003-4, the gap, in other words, the gap between percentages of white students attaining first or upper second degrees and BME students, in 2003-4 it was 17.2%, and in 2009-10 it was 18.6%. So a slight increase in the gap. Again, I don't want to pretend that I can explain exactly why that is, and I suspect it's a degree of factors again, but there remains a gap. And once again, the gap is highest between white students and black students, where in 2010 the difference was 29.8%, quite considerable gap. And over 2/3 of white qualifiers, no, forget about that. That confuses me, and therefore I will confuse you if I give you that information. Moving on then, I thought I'd give you this chart, complex as it is, because it's quite an interesting representation. It's not an ECU, it's not ECU data, it's from the Runnymede Trust. And I don't know how clear the colour is on the overhead, but basically the column, the kind of mauvey column to the left is attendance at FE College. The next column, which is kind of maroony, is attendance at higher education college. Then there is a very thin yellow column, which you can probably see best in the unknown horizontal line, third from the end, which is HEI Other. I actually tried to find out what HEI Other is, but I don't know, I'm afraid. You may know. But anyway, it's tiny. Then the next column, which is kind of pale mint green, is attendance at post-92 universities. Then the purple is pre-92 universities. And finally, the I don't know if it's column, but anyway, the colour on the right, the kind of magenta orange, is Russell Group. So as you can see, if you kind of need to examine this for about 3 hours before you kind of get the picture. But if you kind of look at headline issues, you can see that the biggest, within each black or minority ethnic group, the highest proportion at Russell Group are Asian Chinese heritage students, and the lowest proportion are black Caribbean students. And then you can sort of do similar kind of understandings reading across equally. And it's a different way of representing the current picture, by the way, this is from 2010, of attendance in tertiary education in the UK at the moment. I think one of the important messages from this is that black and minority ethnic students are clearly not homogenous, evidently not homogenous, and I'm pretty sure no one does this, but it's completely wrong when thinking about widening participation or equality simply to think of white students and BME students. The picture is different. What doesn't appear on this data is Gypsy and Romani and traveller students, who are the most underrepresented in tertiary education, period. And also, other data tells us, for example, that if you're going back to attainment, outcomes for British Bangladeshi heritage students, in other words, British students whose families have their heritage in Bangladesh, is quite different compared to outcomes from international Bangladeshi heritage students. In other words, students who are overseas students funded privately from Bangladesh. Most analysts would talk to the impact of class as the reason for the differing outcomes. And the same is true for slightly different reasons between black African British students and black Caribbean British students, because of the different metrics relating to class, in my view. If you, as I'm sure many of you do, if you begin to examine the intersection of these various identities and experiences and heritages, you get quite a complex but interesting picture which should inform, I think, all of our work. ECU held a joint conference with the Higher Education Academy and Coventry University in 2010 on meeting the challenge, improving black and minority ethnic student success and attainment, which was designed to showcase initiatives that institutions have put in place to address the attainment gap. And that, alongside an earlier report that ECU did in 2008 with the Academy on ethnicity, gender and degree attainment, flagged up a variety of initiatives which made a difference, to do with essentially effective data collection and action, learning, teaching, assessment and student support, perceptions and understanding, institutional infrastructure and governance, policies and practice, and indeed the need for more research. And it's those areas which ECU and others I know will continue to work in. Looking now to disability, on the face of it, of those students for whom disability information was available, the proportion known to have a disability has increased from 5.5% in 2003-04 to 7.6% in 2009-10. A lot of anecdotal evidence tells us that a lot of that increase is to do with a greater declaration by people with specific learning difficulties, so dyslexia, dyspraxia, and similar impairments. That's perhaps not surprising, because people with other impairment groups like physical or sensory impairments probably had relatively high levels of declaration anyway. There are, nevertheless, there continues to be lower than average rates of declaration of disability for people with chronic illnesses and particularly mental health conditions. But nonetheless, there has been an increase, whether it's through greater declaration or indeed attendance by disabled students. However, disabled students were less likely to obtain a first-class honours or upper second-class honours degree, 59.9%, as opposed to 63.4%.